The contact klaxon was still climbing through its second cycle when the sky over the Indian Ocean tore open and 211 warships fell out of the wound. I was on the command deck of the Aldermark at 40,000 feet, coffee in my hand, and I watched the translation flare bleach the horizon white from 3,000 kilometers away. Their first scan pulse hit us 4 seconds later, and I felt it in my teeth. I set the coffee down. It did not spill. 30 years of drills will do that to a man's hands even when his stomach has gone somewhere else entirely. Signature match, my signals officer said. Ren Okafor, 26 years old, voice steady the way we trained her to be. Drive harmonics correlate with the scouring archive. Confidence 99.2. Nobody on my deck said anything for a moment. There was nothing to say. Every human being alive had grown up knowing this day was somewhere out ahead of us. The way you know the sea is somewhere below the cloud. 30,000 years of knowing. And now it was a Tuesday, and it was raining over the southern lanes, and they were back. The scan pulse swept the planet twice more. I want you to understand what that pulse was asking, because we had 30 millennia to learn their language, and we knew exactly what it was asking. It was a harvest survey. It was the question you ask of a field you burned and salted and left to cool. What is left and how cheaply can it be taken? They had calibrated it for ash. They had calibrated it for ruins and weather, and maybe at the outside, a few warrens of survivors gone feral in the dark. What it found instead was the loom. You cannot hide an orbital lattice from a harvest survey, and we had no intention of hiding it. 11,000 platforms in woven orbits, each one the size of the old cities, each one armed in ways that have no polite names. The pulse found the Ridge Fleet, next 9-kilometer hulls riding the stratosphere on station, mine among them. It found Meridian Span and the 40 other megacities, found the shield lattice sunk into the crust, found the foundries on the far side of the moon still pouring hull alloy on schedule because nobody had ordered them to stop. Their pulse cut off mid-sweep, not powered down. Cut like a man pulling his hand off a stove. Orders from Continental, Okafor said. Standing order is in effect. We hold dark, we let them look. The standing order is older than any nation that exists today. It was drafted by people who lived in deep shelters and breathed scrubbed air and buried their dead in numbered niches, and it has been amended, ratified, and resworn by every human generation since. It is not complicated. It says when they return, we do not flinch, we do not posture, and we do not fire first. We let them see what the field grew while they were away. So we held dark, and we watched them argue. You could read the argument in their formation. The host had dropped out in a harvest spread, wide, lazy, the geometry of a force expecting to divide a carcass. Within an hour, the spread collapsed into a war globe, tight and bristling. Every lance ship pulled in around the core like fingers closing into a fist. They had crossed 30,000 years of vacuum to collect a dead world, and the dead world was looking back at them with 11,000 eyes. At the center of the globe sat the flagship. Okafor put its profile on my main display, and I heard her breath change before mine did. Hull harmonics, she said. Run them again, I said, and she had already run them 4 times. The flagship was not a sister ship of the vessel that led the scouring. It was not a descendant class or a rebuilt pattern. It was the same hull. The same keel that had hung over the Atlantic for 3 days in the oldest nightmare our species owns, the ship whose silhouette is cut into the memorial walls of every city on this planet, the shape that children draw when you ask them to draw the worst thing that ever happened. 30,000 of our years. Some fraction of that for them, out at the speeds they travel between stars. Their crossing had cost them centuries, not millennia, and they had spent those centuries on other worlds doing what they once did to ours. The ship that burned Earth had come back to see if Earth was done burning. Captain Mercer, my first officer, Dahl, big quiet man, 20 years beside me. He nodded at the long-range plot. They're transmitting. It came in on the old band, the one they had used during the scouring, because why would they bother learning whether the livestock had changed frequencies? It was machine-translated battle cant, arrogant in its very grammar, a language built so that every sentence is either an order or a tithe assessment. Continental piped it to every command deck in the fleet, and I will reproduce it the way I heard it, because I have heard it every night since in the moment before sleep. This world is assessed as tithe property of the Ember host under the right of first fire. Cessation of unauthorized construction is commanded. Assembly of yield is commanded. The host has returned for what cooled in its absence. What cooled in its absence? 300 million people died in the scouring, and in their grammar we were a casserole left out overnight. I gave my deck 30 seconds to be angry. You have to. Anger that has never permitted curdles into something worse, and I needed my people clean. Then I keyed the all stations and said, "Stations, hold dark. The standing order holds." And 40,000 feet below us the ocean went on being the ocean, and above us 11,000 platforms went on saying nothing. Continental let the silence stretch for one full orbit of the loom. I have wondered since whether that pause was deliberate theater or simply planet's worth of officers taking one long breath, and I have decided it does not matter, because what it did to the host was the same either way. Silence to a tithe fleet is supposed to mean compliance, but their war globe kept tightening, and their scan pulses kept stabbing out and flinching back, and the silence began to mean something else, and we watched them learn it in real time. Then Continental answered, and the answer was the first move of a plan older than their empire's current borders. Every platform of the loom lit at once. Not weapons fire. Illumination, running lights, targeting arrays, uncaged and glowing. 11,000 stations going from dark stone to lit fortress between one of their heartbeats and the next, a planet putting on its armor in full view of the people who had come to read its will. From the deck of the Aldermark, I watched the lattice come alive across the whole visible sky, line after line of hard white points, and I am not ashamed to say my eyes stung. Every one of those lights was built by somebody who knew they would never live to see this day. They built them anyway. That is the whole story of my species in one sentence, and I watched it written across the morning sky, and then Earth spoke. Continental transmitted on their own ancient band, in their own battle cant, in grammar polished for 30,000 years by people who studied that language specifically, so that one day this sentence could be said correctly. No name attached, no title. A planet does not introduce itself. This world is occupied. Your assessment is rejected. State your business or withdraw. I have heard recordings of great speeches. I have stood at the memorial walls at midnight when the choirs sing the old shelter hymns. Nothing in my life has landed on me like the plainness of those 3 lines. We did not threaten them. We did not catalog our weapons or invoke our dead. We asked them, in the language of tithe and fire, the one question their grammar barely allows a subject world to ask, state your business. The host did not answer for 9 hours. In those 9 hours, my ship was ordered up corridor to the equatorial parley station, and the rest of the Ridge fleet redistributed with us, hulls rising out of cloud banks all along the line of the morning. If you have never seen a 9-kilometer warship breach a storm layer with the sun, behind it, I cannot make you see it now, and the aliens at the bottom of their war globe were seeing 40 of them at once, each one larger than anything in their host, each one moving with the unhurried certainty of a thing that has been rehearsing its place in this formation since before their empire had its present name. We were not displaying for vanity. Every movement was a sentence. The redistribution said, "We have a doctrine for you." The unhurried climb said, "We have rehearsed this." The silence underneath it said the thing we never had to say aloud. At hour 9, the host launched probes, 12 of them atmospheric rated, dropping toward meridian span and the southern megacities in a survey fan. Okafor read their telemetry as they fell and said quietly, "They're not weapons platforms, imaging and sampling. They want to see it up close." "Then they'll see it," I said. Continental was saying the same thing in harder grammar at the same moment. The order came down the fleet to let the probes descend, unobstructed, all the way into the lanes of the cities themselves. Let them photograph the towers. Let them measure the shield lattice from underneath. Let them count the foundry plumes on the horizon and sample the clean air we made out of the poisoned sky their grandsires left us. Let them take it all home to their pyre marshal, every pixel, and let him understand the size of the mistake before anyone said another word. The probes fell for 6 minutes. 11 of them made the lower sky. And there, at the threshold of our cities, the standing order's second page turned, and Earth introduced the Ember host to a kind of weapon they did not have a word for. The probes did not explode. Nothing shot them down. They simply stopped. 11 machines arrested mid-fall above the rooftops of 3 cities, held in interdiction fields the way a man's wrist is held by a stronger man who has decided the argument is over. From the Aldermark's long lenses, I watched one of them hang above the meridian-span traffic lanes, thrusters firing full reverse, full forward, full lateral, accomplishing exactly nothing. Below it, the morning commute went on. A city of 90 million people did not bother to look up. That was the lesson, and it was deliberate. Continental could have burned those probes in the high air with any of 10,000 systems. Instead, Earth caught them gently, the way you catch a wasp in a glass, and the message inside the gentleness was worse than fire. Fire says we can destroy you. The glass says we can afford not to. For an hour, the probes hung there while their mother fleet's transmissions grew, shorter and sharper. Then the interdiction fields rotated each machine to face upward, toward the host watching from orbit, and Earth let them go. All 11 climbed home untouched. Their sampling bays were empty. Their imaging cores had been wiped clean of every photograph of our cities, every measurement of our lattice, every gram of our air. Wiped clean, except for one file, loaded into every core, 11 copies traveling back up to the war globe at once. It was ground footage of the scouring, the real archive, not the memorial cut. 3 days compressed into 11 minutes. The first lance strikes coming down through a blue sky onto cities whose names we still teach. The firestorms walking westward. The flagship, their flagship, the same hull now hanging at the center of their formation, turning slowly above the burning coast like a man inspecting his work. The last 40 seconds were a single unbroken shot, taken by a survivor whose name we know, of a shelter door closing on the daylight. Then black. Then, in their own battle cant, in their own tithe grammar, a single appended line. We kept better records than you did. Dahl read the transmission log over my shoulder and let out a long, slow breath. They'll call it defiance, he said. It isn't, I said. It's a citation. We're showing the court the evidence before the hearing starts. I will tell you what I believe happened aboard that flagship in the next 3 hours, because we heard the shape of it in their traffic, even where we could not read the words. 11 probe corps came home carrying proof that the herd they had come to collect had documented the original crime, preserved the documentation across 30,000 years, translated its grievance into the executioner's own language, and could reach into the executioner's machines as easily as opening a drawer. Their traffic volume tripled. 2 of their lance squadrons broke the war globe without orders and had to be recalled. Whatever discipline holds a tithe fleet together, we had put a thumb on it and pressed. And then the Pyre Marshal spoke for the first time. The transmission came down on the old band, but the voice was new. Not the flat machine cant of the assessment, but a living voice, deep and doubled, the way their throats layer 2 tones at once. Continental's linguist tagged the speaker designation, and my display rendered it in plain script. Pyre Marshal Covet, bearer of the 9th Ember, commanding the host. What he said translated, as closely as their grammar allows, to this. The tithe world has grown disorderly in the host's absence. Disorder in a tithe world is an inheritance dispute, not a war. The host will convene the dispute. Send what passes for your elders. Inheritance dispute, Okafor repeated. Her jaw was tight. Her family is shelter line, like mine, like half the fleet's. 300 million people, and we're a probate case. It's a ladder he's climbing down, I told her. Loud enough for the deck to hear it, because they needed to hear it. An hour ago, we were furniture. Now we're a party to a dispute. Watch what we are by the end of the week. I should tell you who we were, the people watching that screen, because the host never once asked. My name is Ilon Mercer. I have commanded the Aldermark for 11 years. My line goes back, mother-son to daughter, to Shelter 41 under what used to be the Anatolian Plateau. We know this not by legend but by registry, because the shelters kept registries and the registries survived, because the one thing my species decided in the dark was that nothing would ever be forgotten again. That decision outlived languages. It outlived the shelters themselves, and the nations that built them, and the climate the scouring poisoned, which took us 4,000 years to scrub clean. Memory is the only cathedral every human civilization since has agreed to keep building. And memory, it turns out, is a weapons program. Every shelter registry fed the deep registry. Every land strike signature recorded in those 3 days of fire was preserved, modeled, and answered. Not in one generation, not in 10, but continuously the work handed forward like a lamp, until the answer to every weapon they had used on us was woven into the crust and the loom and the hulls of the Ridge fleet. The host had spent its crossing centuries burning other fields. We had spent 30,000 years studying 3 days. There is no fair fight between those 2 ways of spending time. There was never going to be. Continental accepted the parley. The reply went up in their cant and moved the furniture again, just slightly. In a way I am told their grammar registered like a blade sliding half out of a sheath. The dispute will be convened in Earth's sky, aboard an Earth hull at Earth's appointed hour. The host's delegation is granted safe passage. Granted, the verb a landlord uses. We had begun the morning as their casserole. By nightfall, we were issuing them permissions. The appointed hull was mine. I got the order at dusk, and I will be honest with you, my first feeling was not pride. It was the cold weight a man feels when history turns its head and looks at him. Specifically, the Aldermark would take station at the equatorial parley corridor at dawn, with the Ridge fleet in attendance formation and the loom standing visible overhead, and a Vethari delegation would cross onto an Earth deck, for the first time since their species put fire on ours. We worked through the night. Not weapons drills, protocol. The standing order has an entire annex for this day, drafted and redrafted by 1,200 generations of planners, and its discipline is exact. No honor guard with leveled arms, no display of weapons within the parley bay, no banners of grief, none of our dead's names spoken where the delegation can hear. Cold correctness. The annex has a phrase for the register we were to hold, and the phrase is older than my language. Let the house be cold and clean, make them feel the draft. Dahl found me on the gallery at 4 in the morning, looking down through the deck glass at the moonlit cloud floor. He stood beside me a while in the easy silence of a man you have trusted for 20 years. 11 probes, he said finally, 211 hulls. One flagship 30,000 years old. You know what we still don't know. What they came back as, I said. Conquerors come with more. Salvagers come with less. They came with exactly enough to strip a dead world, Dahl said. It's a harvest manifest, that fleet. Which means every hour they're learning their manifest is wrong, and a tithe fleet that can't tithe is a thing with no instructions. He looked up, toward where the war globe sat above the atmosphere like a clenched fist on a glass table. No instructions is the dangerous part, Ilon. He was right, and I knew he was right, and at dawn we found out how right. Because at dawn, while their delegation shuttle was already falling toward my deck under safe passage, one of their brand captains decided that the dispute should be settled the old way after all, and put a lance strike into the sky over Meridian span. The lance came down at 0611 local out of a clear violet morning from a squadron of 9 hulls that had detached from the war globe's trailing edge, an hour earlier under the designation we would later learn meant Third Ember. 9 hulls, 1 firing solution, full military power, aimed at the administrative heart of a city of 90 million people, while their own delegation was still falling toward my deck under a flag of safe passage. I watched it happen on the main display, and I want to be precise about what I watched, because the precision is the point. The lance crossed the upper interdiction shell in 0.04 of a second. The shield lattice over Meridian span, the deep lattice, the one sunk into the crust by engineers whose bones are 400 generations of dust, rotated its geometry to meet the exact harmonic signature of a Vethari siege lance, because the exact harmonic signature of a Vethari siege lance has been on file with us since the year we call zero. The strike did not splash against a wall. It was caught, decomposed, and drunk, the lattice swallowing the energy in a cascade we could see from 40,000 feet as a slow ring of auroral light rolling outward across the morning sky, the most beautiful thing I have ever watched do nothing. 96% of the strike died in that ring. The other 4% found the seam. There is always a seam. No defense is a circle. Every defense is a chain, and a chain is made of joins. The bleed-through rode a lattice junction down onto the holosphere, a mid-altitude platform settlement strung beneath the shield anchor like a town built on a bridge. Power workers, lattice engineers, their families, the people whose whole purpose was keeping that junction alive. The arc that got through was, by the mathematics of the thing, a candle flame off a bonfire. It was enough. A quarter of the tier's western span burned. People died in that burning whose names are now cut into the wall at Meridian span with all the others. The first names added to that wall in 8,000 years. And the masons who cut them used the same tools and the same depth of cut as the oldest names beside them, because grief on this world has a single standard and it does not depreciate. On my deck nobody screamed and nobody swore. There was one sound, deck-wide, a kind of exhalation with iron in it. Then Okafor said, "Continental is designating the firing squadron," and the standing order turned to the page we had hoped to leave closed, and Earth answered. I need you to understand what the answer was not. The answer was not the loom opening up on the war globe. It was not 211 hulls burned in their formation, which, and I say this flatly, as a professional assessment, not a boast, was an option available within the first 90 seconds. The standing order forbids the avalanche. The avalanche teaches the wrong lesson. The avalanche says we are dangerous when angered. The lesson Earth had prepared for 30,000 years was colder and infinitely worse. It says we are precise when calm. At 0614, 3 minutes after the lance, the answer began, and it was addressed only to the 9. The Third Ember Squadron lost its drives first. Not to explosions, to interdiction, the same gentle glass that had caught the probes, scaled up by 5 orders of magnitude, projected from loom platforms that had been holding firing solutions on every hull in the host since the first hour of the first day. 9 sets of drive cones simply ceased mid-burn like 9 candles pinched. Then their weapons went dark. Charge banks drained by induction taps the loom threaded through their own hull resonances. Their own resonances, the ones we recorded while those same patterns of ship were parked over our burning coasts 30,000 years ago, taking their time, certain no one below would survive to use the data. Then last, with the 9 hulls blind, disarmed, and adrift, the interdiction fields closed around them whole, and the loom reeled them down out of their formation, slowly, visibly, in full sight of their host, and parked them in a neat row in middle orbit like confiscated bicycles. 91 seconds, first Lancelas hull. No Vethari crew member died. That detail was not mercy in the soft sense. The Standing Orders Annex states the reasoning in one line, and the line was drafted by a shelter generation that had every cause to want blood. The dead learned nothing. The war globe convulsed. Squadrons wheeled, lances charged, the whole formation flexing toward the reprisal that every instinct in a tithe fleet demanded, and then froze because every targeting system in the host lit up at once with the same discovery. The Loom was not acquiring them. The Loom had acquired them on day one and had simply never let go. 11,000 platforms, 202 remaining hulls, every solution already computed, every one of their drive harmonics already on file, the firing geometry of their entire formation a problem Earth had finished solving before their pyre marshal had finished his first sentence. They were not facing a defense. They were standing inside a closed hand that had not yet chosen to be a fist. The host held its fire. I have heard people call that wisdom. I think it was simpler. I think for the first time in the long fire-lit history of the Ember host, every officer on every deck did the same arithmetic at the same moment and got the same answer. And the answer was 0. And through all of it, this is the part I still turn over at night, the delegation shuttle never altered course. It fell through the whole engagement on its cleared corridor, untouched and untouching, while its escort squadron was plucked out of the sky behind it, and at 06:31 it settled onto my parley deck with its hull ticking and its honor lamps lit, and the Vethery came out to talk. There were 5 of them. I had studied the archive renders all night, and the renders were good, but nothing prepares you for the mass of them in person. 2.5 meters of layered warplate the color of cooling slag, the doubled throats, the eyes set wide in amber under a bone shelf, 4-fingered hands wide enough to palm a man's chest. They came down the ramp into my cold clean bay in tithe formation, a wedge with the senior at the rear, because in their grammar the most important figure is the one most protected. The senior was not Covet. The pyre marshal had sent his herald, an officer whose rank glyphs translated as Voice of the Ninth, whose name we render as Veshkar, and in their protocol this was a calculated insult, the senior partner declining to attend the reading of a junior's will. We knew the insult. The annex had predicted the insult in writing 1,200 years ago. My instruction sat in my ear in the watch commander's level voice. Receive the herald as if the insult were invisible. The draft in the cold house would do the rest. Veshkar stopped 3 meters into my bay and his amber eyes went up to the gallery glass, where the morning sky stood open above us. The Loom was crossing overhead in its slow-woven lines. 2 of my sister ships held attendance formation off either beam, hull shadows lying across the cloud floor like headlands, and in middle orbit, just visible, hung 9 dark beads in a tidy row, the 3rd ember impounded. I watched a being from a species that has burned 100 worlds look at all of that, and I watched his weight shift backward half a step before his discipline caught it. 30,000 years we had waited to see what their faces did. Now I know. You are the elder of this hull, Veshkar said. The translation came flat in a half-second behind the doubled voice. He had not asked it as a question. I am Captain Elon Mercer, I said. You are standing on the Aldermark in the sky of Earth. Your safe passage held while your host broke parley. Note both facts. They were both decisions. His eyes came down from the Loom and fixed on me, and behind them I could see him beginning, slowly and against his whole inheritance, to revise the manifest. We convened in the parley bay under the gallery glass, at a table my fabrication crews had cut overnight from a single slab of hull alloy, Loom, grade alloy, the same material as the lattice platforms. And yes, that was deliberate, and no, we did not explain it. The Standing Orders Annex is very clear that nothing in the room is to be explained. Either they would learn to read us, or they would keep making mistakes, and both outcomes served. Veshkar sat with 2 of his wedge behind him. I sat with Dahl on my right and a woman named Counselor Adeyemi Strand on my left, sent up from Continental in the night, one of the 9 living humans who hold the office the Standing Order calls Reader of the Record, and the only person in the room outranking me. She was 70 years old, gray to the bone, and she had spent 50 of those years studying Vathari tithe law for a meeting nobody could promise her would ever happen. She greeted the herald in his own high-form cant, unassisted, with the accent of his own flagship's founding dialect, and I watched 2.5 meters of warplate go very still. You speak the pyre tongue, Veshkar said. We speak all of your tongues. Adeyemi Strand said, we have had time. The herald opened the way their law requires, and I will compress it, because their law does not compress willingly. The host's claim stood, he said, but the host was prepared to acknowledge changed circumstance. The tithe world had improved itself. Improved property yields better. The dispute could be resolved generously. Earth would retain its cities and its sky, unburned, and in exchange would assess itself. A yield of alloy, of foundry output, of orbital industry, rendered to the host on a recurring cycle. He used a word for the arrangement that the translator rendered, with what I have always suspected was a linguist's quiet contempt as husbandry. They had arrived to collect a carcass. They were now proposing to milk us. In their grammar, this was an enormous concession. And Veshkar delivered it with the strained magnanimity of a creditor having an invoice. And the worst part is that I understood. Tithe law was the only instrument the host had ever needed. He was playing the one string on his instrument in a room where it had already gone silent to an audience that had spent 30,000 years learning every note on it. Adeyemi Strand let him finish. Completely, through every subclause and cadence, while the loom's lines crossed the glass above us. Then she opened the record. The bay's display wall came alive, and for the next 40 minutes Earth presented evidence, not rhetoric. Evidence, in their evidentiary format, structured to the rules of their own tithe courts, which we had reconstructed from the legal preambles their fleet broadcast during the scouring. Because they had read us our rights while they burned, us, the way you notarize a slaughter, and we had kept the notarization. She showed them the strike logs of year 0. Every lance discharge of those 3 days timestamped, geolocated, attributed by Hull. She showed them the harmonic registry, each of the host's ship patterns named and characterized, with marginal annotations in 8 dead human languages and every living one, the same entries recopied and re-verified century upon century, a ledger longer lived than their dynasties. She showed them the atmospheric record, the poisoning, the 4,000-year scrub, the chemistry of it laid out like a coroner's report. And then she showed them the count, not a number read aloud. The standing order forbids performing our dead for them, but the registry index itself, scrolling, name entries in their tens of millions, the file headers alone taking minutes to pass. Veshkar's wedge officers had stopped moving. The herald himself sat through it with his amber eyes fixed and his hands flat on the alloy, and when the index had finished scrolling, he said, "Records of property loss do not amend a claim. The right of first fire is not extinguished by time." "We agree," Adeyemi Strand said. The herald's head tilted. On a human, the gesture would have been curiosity. On him, it read like a fortress rotating a turret. "Time extinguishes nothing," she said. "That is the single point of law on which your court and this world have always been in perfect agreement. Now tell me, voice of the ninth, how long ago to you was the first fire?" And there it was. The question we had waited a geological age to ask across a table. Veshkar answered carefully, sensing the floor moving and not yet seeing how. To the host, he said, the fire was heritage within reach. The crossing had spanned, by ship's reckoning, 940 years. The crusade had spent them among the Veil stars, taking tithe from 11 worlds. He himself was born mid-crossing. His line grandsire had stood deck watch over this very planet during the fire and had spoken of it at the hearth, the burning coastline, the bright sea. To Veshkar it was a grandfather's voyage, a story with smoke on it near enough to warm. 940 years, Adeyemi Strand said. For us, 30,000. Do you understand what that asymmetry made of this dispute before your host ever returned to argue? It made your grievance ancient, Veshkar said. Ancient grievance is dilute grievance. That is the error, she said, and her voice did not rise at all. That is the load-bearing error, Herald, so attend to it. You assume time would do to us what it does to you. Your host skipped across the surface of those years and arrived with its pride intact and its records thinned to a hearth-tale. We lived every one of those years, all the way down. And we discovered what a species can do with 30,000 years if it refuses formally, institutionally, permanently refuses to let a single day of 3 particular days dilute. She nodded at the display wall. You heard your grandsire describe the bright sea. We can tell you which buildings made the brightness, in what order they burned, and the names of the people in them. Your heritage is our evidence. You kept a story. We kept the crime scene. The translator carried it into the doubled language, and I watched the wedge officer's eyes go to their herald, and I understood we had just done something inside their hierarchy that we would only later be able to measure. Veshkar sat back. When he spoke again, the magnanimity had drained out of the cant, and what was left was the first honest sentence the host had transmitted since arrival. What does this world demand? Nothing you have brought, I said. It was my line by arrangement. The reader carries the law, the captain carries the position. No yield, no husbandry, no exchange. This world has one item of business with the Ember host, and it will be conducted with the bearer of the 9th Ember in person, on this deck, not with his voice. The Pyre Marshal does not board the property under dispute. The Pyre Marshal, I said, fired on a civilian city under his own flag of parley 6 hours ago, and the only reason his host still has 202 functioning drives is the patience of the people he came to husband. He will board. He has 9 impounded hulls worth of reasons, and their crews are breathing because we chose it. Tell them both facts. They were both decisions. Veshkar's gaze went up once more to the gallery glass, to the loom going over, line after line, patient as weather. When he looked back at me, he made a gesture I had only ever seen in the archive footage, one armored hand turned palm up and open. In tithe cant, it concedes the floor. The scouring films show their officers offering it to each other over the bodies of our cities. No Vithari had ever directed it at a human. I will carry it, he said. They lifted at dusk. I stood on the gallery and watched the shuttle climb until it was one more ember against the violet, and a Daemi Strand came and stood beside me with her hands folded, looking very old and very calm. He'll stall, she said. 3 days, perhaps 4. He'll convene his brand captains and consult the tithe codes for a precedent, and there is none, and the codes will tell him to reduce us, and his arithmetic will tell him he can't. Somewhere in the middle of that, he is going to attempt the thing they always hold in reserve. He is going to try to leave. I looked at her. 40,000 feet below us, the cloud floor had gone the color of iron. The standing order covers leaving, I said. It does, she said. He is about to discover that the door he came in through belongs to us now. Try to be on deck when he learns it, Captain. The record will want a witness. We buried the Hollister dead on the second morning, while the host hung silent above us doing its arithmetic. I will keep this part short. Because they would have wanted it short. Lattice people are not ceremonial people. But I will not skip it, because everything the host learned in the days that followed, it learned standing on top of this. The names went into the wall at meridian span at first light, cut by hand, each mace working alone in the old way. The city did not stop. That is our custom, and it confuses outsiders. The trams ran, the markets opened, 90 million people went to work, and at the 8th hour, for 1 minute, every one of them stood still where they stood. From the Aldermark's altitude, you could see it, a city's motion stopping all at once like a tide pausing, and along the whole visible line of the Ridge fleet, 49-kilometer hulls dipped their bows into the cloud floor and held them there for the same minute. The host's sensors watched all of it. Good, was Continental's only comment on that point. Let them put it in their logs. My grandmother used to say that our species has 2 faces, and the scouring built them both. The face that cuts the name, and the face that goes back to work. The host had now seen both. What they had not yet seen was the third thing, the thing underneath both faces, and a Daemi Strand had already told me where they would find it. It took Kovet 4 days, not 3. I credit him. He tried everything else first. On the second day, the host's traffic volume fell by half. Councils, the linguist said, brand captains summoned aboard the flagship in shuttles we tracked like beads on a string. On the third day, they tried the tithe codes one more time. A long transmission in high form cant proposing, with the strained dignity of an empire reading its own fine print aloud, that the dispute be referred to a neutral arbiter among the powers of the Veiled Stars. Continental's reply was 9 words. The arbiter would be the record. The venue was this sky. And in the dark hours of the 4th day, with their reserves counting down and their codes exhausted, the Ember host attempted to leave. I was on deck. I had not really left it since the funeral minute. A Daemi Strand's advice had settled into me like a splinter, and so I watched it begin with my own eyes on the long-range plot. The host's 11 drive tenders, the fat-bodied vessels that weave the translation aperture for a fleet too large to jump singly, sliding out of the Warglobe's core and deploying into the lacework formation we knew from the archive. The same formation they had used to depart Earth's sky in year 0. We have footage of that departure too, taken from the ground by people standing in ash, watching the firebearers leave at their leisure. No one alive had ever watched a Vithari fleet open the door. Every officer on my deck stood up without being ordered to. The aperture began to form, a seam of wrong-colored light stitching itself across 200 kilometers of vacuum, the early geometry of the wound they would step through and be gone, out beyond reach, beyond accounting, free to come back in another 30,000 years with a bigger fleet and a better manifest. The loom let them get exactly halfway. I read the engineering brief, and I will not pretend to hold all of it. What I can tell you is what it looked like and what it was. It looked like the seam of light simply losing interest. Dimming, sagging, coming apart into harmless ribbons that faded like breath off glass. What it was the deep lattice doing the thing it had been woven to do since before the first platform went up, drinking the translation harmonic out of local space the way the city shields had drunk the lance. The aperture did not fail. It was declined. 11 tenders poured the full output of a crusade fleet into the stitching for 9 minutes, and the sky of Earth politely declined to tear because the sky of Earth has an owner now, and the owner had 30,000 years to study the one door its enemy ever used. 2 of the tenders burned out their cores trying. The backlash should have cracked them open, would have, anywhere else in the galaxy, and instead the interdiction fields were around them before the casings failed, cradling the breached sections, holding atmosphere in around their crews like a hand cupped over a flame in wind. We did not let their own door kill them. The standing orders reasoning again, drafted in the dark by people with every right to write it differently, the dead learned nothing. For a long minute the host did not move and did not transmit. 202 hulls hung around the corpse of their own escape attempt, and every deck in the Ridge fleet was silent, and I stood looking at the plot with my hands behind my back, and I felt the size of the moment settle over all of us. They could not reduce us, they could not husband us, they could not refer us. And now the whole host knew, all at once, from the pyre marshal down to the last tithe clerk, they could not leave us. The door they came in through belonged to the people they had come to collect. Veshkar's transmission, when it finally came, was a single formal line requesting that the two crippled tender's crews be returned to the host. Continental's answer taught the next lesson in the syllabus. The crews were already on their way home. We had taken nothing and no one. The tenders themselves, mended enough to hold air, were under tow to middle orbit to join the third ember in the impound row, 11 dark beads now, where there had been 9. Then the lesson after that, because Covet was not the only commander in that host doing arithmetic, and desperation runs down a chain of command faster than discipline. On the 5th morning, a brand captain, whose name we render as Drizza of the 5th, Ember took 6 lance hulls out of the globe on a hard, silent burn, not at Earth, not at the door, but at the moon. At the far side foundries, the open industrial sprawl, the one place in the system that looked, to a tithe officer's eye, like an unshielded throat. Take the foundries. The logic ran. Take hostages of value. Trade them for the door. I almost understood it. It was the first thing the host had done since arrival that was in their own grammar truly brave. 6 hulls, alone, against a system that had swallowed every blow without blinking. It was also the most instructive failure of the entire return, because the foundries are not undefended. The foundries are where the loom is born. Drizza's squadron crossed 200,000 kilometers of cislunar space without a shot fired at it, every kilometer deeper into a fire solution that had been waiting since before his line grandsire was whelped, and when his lead hull lit its targeting arrays on the foundry sprawl, the foundry defense grid, the original grid, the oldest weapons platforms my species operates, the ones our histories call the first ring, acquired all 6 hulls in under a second and then did not fire. It spoke instead. On their band, in their cant, from a grid whose bones were forged by the great-great-grandchildren of the Scourings, survivors, you are 6. They looked up. Above the lunar plane silent, holding station where they had been holding it unannounced for 3 days against exactly this contingency, sat 60 hulls of the Ridge fleet's outer wing. 60. We had moved a fleet larger than anything the host could mass through their own sensor shadow. Without being seen, because we have had 30,000 years to learn our own sky's shadows, and we had parked it over the one asset a desperate tithe officer would reach for, because Adeyemi Strand and her readers had wargamed the desperation of tithe officers for 50 years. Drizza's 6 hulls powered down their arrays. They were escorted, not impounded, escorted. The distinction was loud, back to the war globe by human warships that never once raised a weapon, and the last ship in the escort line, as it peeled away, transmitted a single line of cant at the 5th Ember's commander that the linguists swear was composed centuries ago and held in reserve like everything else we own. The foundries also remember you. They built everything you have seen. That night, the 6th night, the flagship transmitted at last, not the herald. The deep doubled voice we had heard once before on the first day when it had commanded us to assemble our yield. It did not command now. The grammar had moved all the way down the ladder, every rung of which we had built under it one cold lesson at a time. Pyre Marshal Covet, bearer of the 9th Ember, requested the consent of Earth to board the Aldermark. Consent. Adeyemi Strand read the cant form twice and looked at me over the display, and for the first time in 6 days the reader of the record smiled, very slightly, with no warmth in it at all. The smile of a woman whose predecessors, 400 generations of them, had each in turn closed the same unfinished ledger and handed it forward, and who had just heard the debtor knock on the door. Granted, she said. Cold and clean, Captain. Let him feel the draft. I have skipped a day, and I should not. Because the day I skipped is the one the Veil Stars will be arguing about long after my name has weathered off whatever stone it ends up on. Between the death of their door and the Pyre Marshal's request to board, there was one more attempt. The strangest one, the oldest one, the one their codes hold in reserve beneath even the breakaway run. On the 5th evening, in the hour after Drizza's escorted squadron limped back into the globe, the flagship transmitted a challenge under the seal of the 9th Ember. The linguists worked it for an hour before they brought it to Continental, because the form was so archaic that half its glyphs predated the version of the cant we had built our dictionaries on. It was an invocation of what their oldest codes call the trial of the standing flame. When 2 claims to a field cannot be resolved by fire or yield, each side puts forward one champion, and the champions meet on the disputed ground, and the field goes to the victor's banner, and both hosts are bound by it before their gods and their dead. Single combat for Earth. They were proposing to settle 30,000 years with a duel, because a duel was the last instrument left in the case, and because, Adamistrand saw it instantly, a duel was the one arena where a tithe warrior 2.5 meters tall in warplate might still believe the arithmetic favored him. Lose the trial and they lose what was already lost. Win it, and the codes hand them back with honor everything their fleet could not take. My deck wanted us to refuse with contempt. I confess that for about a minute I did too. The presumption of it, the burned coast below us, and these people reaching for a dueling code. It was Adamistrand who stopped Continental from refusing, and her reasoning is in the record now, and it is taught, I am told, in their courts as well as ours. A refusal, she argued, the host could use. Refusal of the standing flame is in their oldest law, the act of a power that fears its own champion, and Covet's brand captains would feed on it for a generation. Acceptance was impossible. Refusal was fuel. So Earth did the third thing. Earth answered the challenge with a question of standing. The reply went up over the reader's own seal, in glyphs as archaic as theirs, because of course we had the old glyphs too. We have everything. The trial of the standing flame, the reply observed, may be invoked only between claimants to a field. It binds host against host, banner against banner. It has no provision, and here the record cites their own code, chapter and verse, in a recension older than the one their own archivists carry, no provision for a claimant to challenge the field itself. A champion may face a champion. No champion faces the ground he stands on, the air he breathes, the tide that comes in around his boots. State, the reply concluded, which of Earth's claimants you wish to fight. The host has met none. The host has been arguing for 19 days with the planet. I watched the transmission go, and I remember thinking it was a lawyer's trick, elegant and cold, and that they would read it as evasion. Dahl read my face and shook his head slowly and said, no, think like their deck, Elon. Every soldier in that globe has spent 5 days asking himself who we are, who the enemy is, where his face is, which hull is the one to die against. We just told them the truth. There isn't one. They came to fight somebody, and there's nobody here. There's just the place, and the place is awake. He was right. The linguist charted the host's traffic after our reply went up, and it did not spike the way it had after the door or the foundries. It sank. Hour after hour, band after band, the great fleet going quiet from the outside in, the silence of soldiers lying in their racks staring at the overhead, and somewhere in that long sinking quiet, I am as sure of this as I am of anything in my life, the Ember host stopped being a crusade and became 11,000 people very far from home, in debt in the rain, on a field with no one to duel. The challenge was never formally withdrawn. Their codes have no form for withdrawing it. No one had ever needed one. It simply sits in the record now, the last weapon the Ember host ever raised against Earth. A duel declined on the grounds that the defendant is a world with the defendant's compliments and a citation. It was the next morning that Veshkar came down alone and stood at my rail and told me his bearer had already decided. And it was that same evening, with the challenge dead in the water behind him, and his codes finally, completely empty, that Covet transmitted his request to board the Aldermark. In the consent grammar, the petitioner's grammar, and the reader of the record smiled her cold small smile and granted it. Covet came down at noon, alone except for 2 honor-bearers he left standing at the shuttle ramp, which in his protocol meant he came naked. He was old. I had not expected that, though I should have. 940 ship years of crusade, and he had been a deck officer at the start of the crossing. The warplate was the same cooling slag color as his herald's, but the body inside it had begun to gather inward the way old soldiers' bodies do in any species, and the amber eyes under the bone shelf had the particular stillness of a commander who has finally run out of subordinates to send into a problem instead of himself. He crossed my cold, clean bay and stopped at the regulation distance, and the first thing the bearer of the 9th Ember said on a human deck was not in cant. It was in our language, accented, machine learned in 4 days, but ours and his doubled throat fought the single-toned words like a man chewing stone. You're dead. From the platform. I am told their names are cut in stone. They are, I said. The ones who fired were of my host and under my flag. He stood very straight. Their act is mine to carry. I do not ask its forgiveness. I ask its price. It was a better opening than anything the Annex had wargamed, and I gave him the only honest answer in the room. That's above me, Pyre Marshal. But the price isn't going to be paid in the coin you're used to. Walk with me. There's something you're owed to look at before the reader opens the ledger. I took him up to the gallery rail. This was scripted. The Annex calls it the standing hour, and 1,200 years of planners had argued over every sight line. But I will tell you the truth. By the time we reached the rail, I had stopped feeling the script, and I think he had never been inside one. We stood at the glass with the afternoon stacked up beneath us. 40,000 feet down, the cloud floor had broken open over the coast, and through the gap you could see meridian span running to the horizon. The towers with the sun on them, the shield lattice's faint auroral shimmer, the traffic lanes pulsing like blood in a wrist. Above us, the loom went over in its woven lines. Off both beams my sister ships held attendants, hull shadows lying kilometers long across the cloud, and in middle orbit, if he cared to look, 11 dark beads in a row. He looked for a long time. His reflection in the glass did not move at all. My line grandsire stood watch over this coast, he said finally. He spoke of it at the hearth, when I was young, in the middle of the crossing. The bright sea, the pillars of smoke. He called it the cleanest fire of his life. The amber eyes did not leave the city. I have seen his logs. There was nothing here human. Nothing left. We do not leave fields half-burned. It is the first discipline of the tithe. I have spent 4 days reading my own host's records of this world's death, and they are good records, and they are wrong, and I am standing in the sky of the proof. So you will answer me one question, captain to captain, before your reader buries me in law. He turned from the city and looked at me. How? You want the engineering, I said. You won't get it, and it wouldn't answer you anyway. The how isn't in the foundries. I nodded down at the gap in the clouds. You were right. There was nothing left. Your grandsire's logs are accurate. Our own records agree with them, and ours are better. 3 days of fire, the sky poisoned behind you, the survivors a rounding error in the dark. That's the field you left. I let the rail take my weight, and I said the thing every human child learns before they learn long division. Here's what your discipline never had a category for, Pyre Marshal. A rounding error that refuses to forget is not a rounding error. It's a seed. Seeds grow or die, Kovit said. They do not aim. Ours aimed. I held up one hand and counted it for him on my fingers, because he was owed the plain arithmetic and because the annex, wisely, left this part to the captain's own words. The shelters kept registries. The registries became the deep registry, and the deep registry became a law older than any of our nations. Nothing is forgotten again, ever. That's one. The survivors' children scrubbed the sky you poisoned. 4,000 years. Pyre Marshal, 160 of your hearth generations bent over one wound, and when it was clean they didn't rest. They asked what else could be made unpoisonable. That's two. Somewhere in the dark centuries somebody wrote down the second law. They came once, they will come again, and we will not be afield twice. Every government we have had since, every language, every faith, every age of the world, has ratified that sentence. We have lost everything else over 30,000 years, more times than you have worlds. We never once lost that. That's 3. I lowered my hand. Your host crossed 9 centuries and called it patience. We sat in one place for 300 centuries, sharpening one answer. You never had a chance, and I need you to understand that the answer was never built to chase you. Not one platform of the loom can leave this system. Not one hull of this fleet was laid down to cross to the Veil stars. We built a wall, not a spear. You are only in danger here. You brought yourselves to the wall. He was silent for the better part of a minute. Below us, the city ran on, ignorant and shining, every tower of it standing on the shoulders of people who had died certain the towers would come. On the first day, Kovit said slowly, your world lit its lattice all at once. I took it for display. Threat posture. The doubled voice dropped into something I had not heard from any of them, a register their cant probably has no glyph for. It was not display. You were showing us the work. An accounting before any word was spoken. 30,000 years of labor, lit up item by item, so the debtor could read the invoice from orbit. His head turned back to the glass. We taught you that. The notarized fire. You kept our forms and filled them with yourselves. The reader would say you taught us bookkeeping, I said, and we taught ourselves what to keep. And what is owed human? Your reader will tell me in law, tell me at the rail. What does a world ask? That waited 30,000 years and built this, and caught our lances with its bare lattice, and holds our doors shut, and cuts its dead into stone at the same depth forever. What is the yield of all of it? His eyes came back to me, old and amber and genuinely, bottomlessly lost. What do you want? It was the question the whole return had been spiraling towards since the first scan pulse flinched, and the answer had been waiting longer than his empire's name. I straightened off the rail and gave it to him the way the annex orders it given, plainly once without heat. We want you to leave, I said, with our permission and never come back. And we want every world of the Ember Host and every power of the Veil Stars to know exactly why you asked for it. Before the reader opened the ledger that evening, Kovit made one request of his own, and the way Earth answered it belongs in this account, because it was the only time in the whole return that I watched the standing order say no. He asked to visit the wall. He made the request at the rail, formally, in the petitioner's grammar he was already learning to wear. The bearer of the 9th Ember wished to stand before the wall of names at meridian span, in person, unarmed and unattended, and look upon the account of the first fire with his own eyes. By his codes, it was an act of enormous weight, A debtor presenting himself to the dead, the heaviest gesture of standing his law allows. I believe he meant it, believed it then, watching the old eyes when he asked, and I believe it now. It was the largest thing he had, and he offered it. Continental's answer came back in under an hour over the reader's seal, and it was one sentence long. The dead of this world do not receive you. I watched him take it. I had watched him absorb the caught lances, the declined door, the impound row, the foundry ambush, each one a structural failure somewhere inside the architecture of what he had crossed the dark believing, and none of them moved him the way that one sentence did. The war plate did not shift, the amber eyes did not drop, but something behind them sat down, slowly the way an old man sits when the last train is gone, and when he spoke again his voice had a flaw in the doubling, a hair of separation between the two tones, that the linguists tell me their kind cannot produce on purpose. In my codes, he said, there is no refusal of the debtor's presentation. The dead are owed the sight of him. It is their final yield. In ours, I said, the dead are owed quiet. They paid for it. You'd be one more thing from the sky, standing in their light, and they have seen everything from the sky they are ever going to be asked to see. The wall isn't for you, Pyre Marshal. Nothing on this world is for you. That's not an insult. It's the whole finding of the case. He stood with that the way he stood with everything, motionless, the city running on far below the glass. Then the account closes, he said at last, without my kind ever once standing where it happened. We will carry home a verdict for a place we were never permitted to touch twice. The doubled voice rejoined itself, slow and level. Your readers are more terrible than your lattice human. The lattice only kills. They have found the one tithe my codes cannot assess, to be held outside forever by a door that answers politely. There is no glyph for what that costs. There is, I said. We cut 300 million of them into stone. He did not answer that. There was no answer to that, and he was by then wise enough in our grammar to know it. And an hour later he sat down at the alloy table across from the reader of the record, and the ledger was opened, and the 3 sentences of Earth's terms were read into the long silence he brought down from the rail with him. The ledger was opened that evening in the parley bay, at the alloy table, under the gallery glass with the loom going over. Adeyemi Strand sat opposite the Pyre Marshal with the record seal case open in front of her, and she read Earth's terms in high form cant in full, while I stood witness at the foot of the table, and the linguist's translation scrolled silently down my sleeve display. There were 3 terms, 30,000 years, and it came to 3 sentences. The first, the Ember host would depart Earth's system under Earth's permission and escort by the door Earth would open for it, and the right of first fire over this world would be formally extinguished in the host's own codes. Not lapsed, not deferred, extinguished, struck from the tithe rolls by the bearer's own seal, the first entry ever removed from them in the history of their empire. The second, the host would carry the record home. Not a summary, not a protest. The record, the whole evidentiary mass of it. The scouring archive, the registry of names, the atmospheric coroner's report, and appended to it the complete sensor log of these 9 days. Every caught lance and declined aperture and impounded hull, all of it sealed in their own evidentiary format and keyed for broadcast. And it would be broadcast. Read into the record of every tithe court of the Ember host and transmitted openly to every power of the Veil stars, 11 worlds of which, by the host's own logs, were burned by the same fleet on the same crossing. Earth's grievance would not travel as rumor. It would arrive as a verdict in their court's own grammar, with the host itself as the courier, and every burned world listening would know there was a wall at the end of the Vethery Road, and know what the wall had done, and begin perhaps their own long arithmetic. The third term was the flagship. Adeyemi Strand read it without any change in her voice, which was its own kind of mercy, because there was no softening it. The vessel called in the host's rolls Aruan's Pyre, the hull that led the scouring and led the return, would not leave. It would be surrendered, intact, decommissioned, its crew transferred off, to the possession of Earth, as the sole material reparation this world would ever ask for 300 million dead. The ship that burned the world stays on the world. That was the whole of the third term. It had been drafted, the record's marginalia note, in the 402nd year after the scouring, by a committee of shelter descendants who reasoned that any future host would sooner part with a fleet than with that one keel, and that this was precisely the measure of the asking. Kovet did not move for a long time after she finished. When he spoke past her to me, captain to captain, as if the law were a weather he could step out of. The Pyre is not a hull, he said. You know this, your readers know this. That is why it was chosen. She is the crusade. My line was whelped aboard her. Every bearer of every ember took the flame from her decks. There are shrines in her keel older than your towers, human, older than your wall of names. The doubled voice was very low. You ask me to come home from the long crossing without the crossing's heart. and to stand before my own courts as the bearer who left her on a tithe world. The host will call it what their codes call it, hull death. There are brand captains in my globe tonight who would burn with her first and mean it. We know, I said. We counted on you being better arithmetic than they are. And if I refuse? A Strand closed the seal case with a small exact click. Then the host remains, she said. You are not besieged, Pyre Marshal. You are simply unpermitted. Your reserves are yours to spend as slowly as you like. The door will stand shut, the impound row will keep its beads, and Earth will wait. We are, and she let the pause stand for exactly one breath, very good at it. He took it back to the globe that night. We watched the shuttles run again, flagship to brand ships and back, and the linguists charted the traffic like a fever. On the second day of it, the fever broke the way fevers do, loudly. 3 lance hulls of the 7th Ember lit their drives without orders and made a run at the open sky, not toward the moon, not toward the door, toward nothing. The pure animal refusal of cornered soldiers, and the loom caught all 3 before they cleared the globe's own perimeter, drained them, and set them in the impound row, 14 beads now, and Continental returned their crews to the flagship within the hour, alive, unharmed, and pointedly unasked about. The standing order does not punish despair, it just keeps receipts. And on the 3rd day, Veshkar came down alone, unannounced, and asked to stand at the gallery rail, and I let him. And we did not speak for most of an hour while the city ran on under the broken cloud. He was not seeing the towers, I think. He was reading the invoice again. He will yield her, the herald said at last, tonight or tomorrow. I have served him 900 years, Captain. I tell you this not as treason, but as weather. He decided at the rail when you said the word seed. Everything since is grief looking for an exit that is not surrender. And there is none, and he knows the codes better than any bearer living. A host that cannot tithe, cannot leave, and cannot die usefully has one instruction remaining. The amber eyes came around to me. What I do not know, what none of us can compute, and it is making my officers strange, is why you have not taken more. You hold the door. You hold our drives in your hand. The codes say the victor's claim is the whole of the field, and you ask for 1 hull and a courier run. He made a small gesture at the glass, at the lattice shimmer over the towers, at all of it. You could ask for the crusade entire. Why is the asking so small? I thought about the wall at Meridian Span, the new names cut at the old depth. I thought about Shelter 41 and the registry line that runs from its dark to my deck. I thought about what I would want if I were the dead. Because we're not collecting a debt, I said. We're closing one. Your codes don't have the difference in them. That's the flaw in the whole instrument, Herald. It's why your empire will lose every world it ever burned, one long memory at a time, whether we broadcast the record or not. A debt collected breeds the next crossing. A debt closed ends the road. Earth decided a very long time ago in the dark, while your grandsires were telling hearth stories about our bright sea, that when you finally came back, we would want exactly one thing more than we wanted: revenge. I looked down at the city. To be finished with you. Veshkar stood with that for a while. Then he said, in his own cant, quietly, a sentence the translator rendered with what I choose to believe was perfect fidelity. We woke something patient and called the patient's death, and the field grew teeth and waited for the farmer. He turned from the rail. I will tell the bearer the draft is colder upstairs. At dusk the next day, the flagship transmitted the form of words their codes reserved for the rarest instrument in tithe law, the one their courts had recorded only twice in the history of the Ember Host, both times spoken by enemies of the host on the wrong end of the fire. Kovitz spoke it himself in cant and then unprompted, in our language on the open band, with 202 hulls and 11,000 platforms and a lit blue planet listening. The Ember Host petitions the world Earth, he said, for permission to depart. Earth did not answer for a full day. That too was the annex the planners had written, with the dry exactness I had come to love them for, that a permission begged for must be slept on by the beggar once, so that the asking has time to become true. The host hung in its globe through one whole rotation of the world it had twice crossed a galaxy to take, watching the cities turn under the lattice shimmer, dayside to nightside to day, and every hour of that silence was load-bearing. Then Continental spoke, on the open band, in both languages, in 9 words drafted 400 generations ago against this exact morning. Permission is granted upon the terms in this order. The order mattered. Everything we did mattered. By then, even their tithe clerks had learned to read us. First the extinguishing, because the law comes before the logistics, and Earth wanted the law dead before a single drive lit. The seal ceremony was held aboard the Aldermark at noon at the alloy table, and it was the shortest great event I ever expect to witness. Kovit came down with his seal bearers in the original tithe roll of the crossing, an actual physical object, a meter-long lattice of fused crystal plates, 900 years of claims and yields cut into it the way we cut names into stone. The entry for Earth was the first plate. He read it aloud as their codes require, the assessment of Year Zero, the Bright Sea Coast, the projected yield of a cooled world. His grandsire's arithmetic, carried across 30,000 of our years to be read one last time in the sky. It had been wrong about. Then he set his seal against the plate and spoke the form of extinguishment, and the crystal took the cancellation cut with a sound like a struck bell, and the first claim in the history of the Ember Host was struck from the rolls forever. A Diemi Strand witnessed it for the record without a word. When it was done, she did the single thing the annex left to the reader's own discretion, the one human gesture of the entire return. She had the bay's display wall show for 10 seconds, the wall at meridian span, the whole kilometers-long sweep of it, 30,000 years of names, and then the newest section, the Hollistier names, the stone still bright from the chisel. She let the pyre marshal look at what his host's last lance had bought. Then the wall went dark and she said, in his own high-form cant, the account is closed. Carry it home open so it is never opened again. The record's courier mass was loaded that afternoon, a sealed core the size of a shuttle, escorted up to the flagship by 2 of my sister ships, and the linguists confirmed its broadcast keys live and irrevocable before it ever crossed into their hold. Whatever else the Ember Host lost above Earth, it left as the carrier of the most complete account of its own crimes ever assembled, addressed to its own courts, in its own grammar, with its own seal of extinguishment appended as the closing exhibit. There are worse fates for an empire than defeat. We had spent 30 millennia designing one, and then the pyre. The crew transfer took 2 days. 11,000 Vethari came off that hull in an unbroken stream of shuttles, and we watched them carry what their codes permitted them to carry. The hearth flames in their iron cages, the keel shrines unbolted plate by plate, the ash urns of 900 years of crusade dead. Continental cleared every gram of it without inspection, the annex again, and I will quote it exactly, because I think it is the finest sentence 1,200 generations of my species ever wrote into a war plan. We make war on no one's dead. Covet walked her decks last, alone. His honor bearers waited at the transfer lock for 11 hours. I do not know what a bearer does. Walking 900 years of empty ship. No human will ever know, and I find I am glad of that. The way you are glad not to have seen a thing you would never afterward unsee. When he came off her at the end, the amber eyes were the same, and the warplate was the same, and something in the way he carried the last hearth cage was not the same, and he crossed to my deck for the final accounting, carrying it himself, which his protocol forbids, and not one of his officers said a word. He stood in my bay with the cage in his hands and the empty flagship hanging huge and dark in the glass behind him, and he said, "She is yours. I am required by my codes to tell you what you have taken, and you will not understand it. Tell me anyway," I said. "You have taken the proof that we were ever young," he said. "Every empire keeps one. Yours is the wall of names. Ours was her." The doubled voice was steady, which made it worse. "Use her well, human, whatever that means to your kind. I find I no longer know what it means to mine." The impound row came home to them that evening. 14 hulls released in sequence, drained, dented, and breathing. Their crews returned to a host that received them, our watch officers noted, without a single recorded reprimand. Whatever the Ember Host had been when it fell out of the wound above the Indian Ocean 19 days earlier, the thing reassembling itself into departure formation was not it. The war globe did not reform. They left their hulls in the open lattice of a convoy, the formation their codes prescribed for passage through a sovereign power's sky, a formation no Vethari fleet had assumed in living or recorded memory, because it concedes in its very geometry that the sky has an owner. On the 20th morning, Earth opened the door. We did not give them their aperture back. We built them a better one, the loom weaving the translation seam itself, wider and cleaner than their tenders could have stitched, holding it open with a casual, sustained precision that was, every officer in both fleets understood, the last and largest item on the invoice. They had come through a door of their own making, certain of the field on the other side. They left through a door held open by the field, like guests with the field's hand visible on the latch. No display in 19 days said it plainer. You only ever left this place because it let you. The host crossed the threshold in good order, squadron by squadron, 11,000 platforms silent above them, 49-kilometer hulls standing attendants below in the morning light. The flagship's place at the convoy's heart rode empty, kept open by their own formation discipline all the way to the seam. An honor gap, the linguists called it, the shape of a carried grief, and not one human instrument was permitted to photograph it by an order a Diemi Strand issued personally, and the record upholds. The account was closed. We did not need the picture. Covet's shuttle was the last hull off the field. It held at the seam's edge for a long moment, and the old voice came down the open band one final time in our language, addressed to no station in particular, and therefore the linguists ruled, to the world. 30,000 years ago, we mistook your silence for death, he said. 18 days ago, I mistook your patience for mercy. I leave knowing both errors. To whatever sits beneath them both to her. Then the scene took the convoy, and the wrong-colored light folded shut behind them, and the sky over the Indian Ocean was just the sky, and on the deck of the Aldermark nobody cheered. The standing order does not forbid it. It has simply never once, in any of its drills or annexes or war games, imagined that we would want to. Okafor was the one who finally broke the silence on my deck, very quietly, reading the lattice status board the way her shelter-line grandmothers must once have read a sealed door's gauges. All platforms report the door closed, Captain, she said. The loom is asking for instructions. Tell it to stand down to the long watch, I said. Same as yesterday. Same as the next 30,000 years. That should be the end of the story, and for 19 days it was. But there was still a 900-year-old warship hanging empty in middle orbit with 300 million names attached to her, and what Earth did with her is the part I most need set down, because it is the part the next 30,000 years will be built on. The argument started before the seam had finished closing, not in the fleet, in the cities. You could follow it across every public band on the planet inside a day. Half the world wanted her broken up in orbit unceremoniously, scattered into the recycling streams like any condemned hull. No shrine for the firebearers, no shape on our horizon, nothing for children to point at. The other half wanted her kept whole, grounded on the scouring coast as a monument, the proof standing in the weather forever, so that no generation could ever soften the memory into a hearth tale the way her builders had. Both sides argued from the same law, the law that nothing is forgotten, and that is why the argument burned so hot. It was the first time in living memory the law had pointed two directions at once. It went to the readers, as everything finally does. Adeyemi Strand heard the briefs herself in the deep registry stone hall, with the record open on the table, and the ruling she handed down was 4 sentences long and ended the argument on the spot, and I will quote it whole, because my species should be known by it. A monument is a wound kept open. The wall of names is monument enough. A scattering is a forgetting. We do not forget. The hull is neither shrine nor trash. The hull is material. And the law of this world is that what comes out of the long dark is put to work. Put to work, 3 plain words, and inside them, the whole shape of us. They brought her down on the 90th day. Not a crash, not a scuttling, the gentlest atmospheric descent ever flown. The loom's interdiction fields carrying her like pallbearers through the high blue, and out over the coast her own lances had once turned bright. I flew escort myself. The Aldermark led the honor line, if that is the right word, and I do not know what else to call it. Below us, down the whole length of the old scouring shore, people had come out to watch. Not a crowd, a population. They stood on the headlands and the tide walls and the roofs of the coast towns, millions of them, in the kind of silence 90 million people only produce on purpose, and they watched the shape from the memorial walls. The silhouette their ancestors had drawn in ash and their children still draw when you ask for the worst thing, come down out of the sky one last time with Earth's hand visibly, unhurriedly on the latch. She settled into the shallows of the bright sea. Kilometers of her, dark and dead and finally just iron, and the tide came in around her keel the way the tide has come in around everything, always. And the silence on the shore held for 1 minute, by no signal anyone sent. And then a tide wall keeper somewhere struck the hour bell, 1 stroke, and the population went home, and the yards moved in at dawn. The disassembly took 11 years. I was there for the first cut, and I had retired by the last, and I drove out to the coast to watch it anyway, an old man among the cutting cranes, because Dahl had told me what the last plate was scheduled to become, and I did not believe him. The yards worked the way we work everything. Registry-grade documentation. Every plate numbered. Every shrine bolt and scorch mark scanned into the record before the torches touched it. Because the law runs all the way down, and her alloy went where all our alloy goes. Into the foundry streams. Into the next generation of tide walls. Into hull stock for 3 new ships of the Ridge Fleet, which means there are decks above the cloud floor today, crewed by the great-grandchildren of the Hollist here, that were once the decks of Oruan's Pyre and are now simply ours, holding the long watch, pointed at nothing but home, and into the loom. That was the last plate, the one I drove out to see, the first plate of her keel, the oldest iron of the Crusade, the metal her empire's whole proof of Youth had been hung on. The yards had milled it clean and cut it to lattice spec, and a foundry tug lifted it off the coast at noon into a hard blue sky, and 11 weeks later it was bolted into the spine of a new platform on the loom's 12th ring, where it is now. It has a small registry mark, nothing more. No plaque, no name, no ceremony. It is not a trophy up there. It is a working part of the wall, doing wall's work, holding a firing solution on the empty sky like everything around it, and it will do that work for 10,000 years beside platforms built from our own mountains, and the law is satisfied. Nothing forgotten, everything put to work, the wound closed, and the stitch left in. Veshkar had asked me, at the rail, why the asking was so small. I think about that question more than any other thing said during the return, because I have come to believe the answer I gave him was true but not finished. The asking was small because the asking was never the weapon. The weapon was the answer we built into ourselves across 30,000 years, that a wrong done to us does not make us collectors, it makes us finishers, that we will absorb what is done, record what is done, outlast what is done, and then close the account so completely that the dark cannot reopen it. The host came back armed for a war or a harvest. We met them with a completed ledger. There is no fleet that can fight that, and the proof is that the greatest tithe fleet of the Veil Stars looked at it for 19 days, and then asked, in our language on the open band, if it could please go home. The record reached their courts. We know because the loom's deep antennas, 11 years on, began to catch the edges of it propagating. Our evidentiary mass, rebroadcast world to world across the Veil Stars in their own grammar, exactly as keyed, the verdict arriving at 11 burned worlds along with the news of where the Vithari road ends. The linguists tell me 2 of those worlds have since gone quiet in a way that reads, on the long instruments, like shelters being dug and registries being started. The patience is spreading, out there in the dark, on fields that learned this week what our field learned 30,000 years ago. I am an old man and I will not live to know what grows. But I know whose seed it is, and I know what the harvest is not going to be, and I know 11 empires of fire are going to learn, one long memory at a time, what the Ember host learned over my deck, that the universe keeps books, and the books outlive the fire, and sooner or later every burned field sends its invoice. I am 81 years old now, and the Aldermark has a new captain. A Hollister woman whose great-grandmother's name is on the wall, which the record notes and the fleet pretends is a coincidence. And I live on the coast, in sight of the shallows where the pyre came down, in a town whose tide wall has her iron in it. I walk the wall most mornings. I knock my knuckles on the rail where the registry mark is, the way half the town does, an old habit with no name, and the iron knocks back, dull and ordinary in ours. People ask me, schoolchildren mostly, brought through on the memorial circuit to gawk at the last living captain of the return, what the moment was. They are always certain there was one. The lance is caught, the door declined, the duel refused, the old marshal carrying his own hearth cage across my deck. They want the moment the way their ancestors wanted rain. And I am old enough now to tell them the truth, which is that the moment was none of those, and it did not happen on my deck. And I missed it like everybody else, because it happened 30,000 years before I was born. In the dark, in the cold, in a numbered shelter under the Anatolian rock, on the day some exhausted survivor with no sky and no reason wrote down the first name, in the first registry, and ruled a line under it and decided, on behalf of every one of us to come, that this would be a species that keeps its books. Everything else was just the books arriving. My granddaughter asked me the better question last spring. She is 9, shelter line on both sides, fierce the way the coast makes them, and we were on the tidewall at dusk when the loom began to light up overhead, ring by ring, east to west, the way it has every nightfall for longer than nations, 11,000 watchfires taking the sky like slow stars. She had just learned the history in school, the real version, with the recordings. She watched the 12th ring come on, and she found the one platform in it that her class had been taught to find, the one with the old keel plate in its spine, and she said, "Are they coming back?" I gave her the answer the readers give, because it is true. No one knows. The dark is large and full of empires, and the record is still propagating, world by world, and the long instruments still catch new silences out there that might be shelters being dug or might be nothing, and the loom holds the watch either way, because the second law does not expire, and we do not gamble what was paid for in the dark. Maybe something comes, someday, that never heard of us. But she is shelter line and 9, and she heard the hole in it. Not something, she said. Them. The ones who asked. And I looked up at the 12th ring, at the little steady light with the nightmare's iron in it, doing Wall's work over a world that learned to make even its wounds stand watch, and I told her what I have never put in any report and will set down here exactly once, so the record has it. No, I said, not them, not ever. Conquerors come back. We built the wall for conquerors. But nothing in this universe that has once asked a field for permission to leave it ever comes back to that field, because the asking changes what they are, all the way down the way the dark once changed us. They will tell it at their hearths for 900 years. Not the lances caught or the door shut, but the moment their bearer stood on a human deck, in a cold, clean room with the whole sky of earth lit up and patient above him, and heard his own voice form our words and beg leave to go. Empires survive their defeats. They do not survive their grammar changing. Somewhere out there in the Veil Stars right now, A young veterinary officer is hearing that story for the first time and feeling the bottom drop out of every code he was whelped on and learning the one thing we spent 30,000 years preparing to teach, that the universe is not a field of harvests. It is a field of memories, and some of them are armed. She thought about that the way 9-year-olds do, all the way down and very fast, and then she knocked her small fist on the registry mark, twice the way the whole town does, and the old iron knocked back, and that satisfied her completely, and we went in to dinner. The lights of the loom were all burning by the time we reached the door, the whole lattice on, ring upon ring, the watch set for the night, the way it was set last night and the way it will be set 10,000 years from tonight, over the cities and the wall of names and the tide walls with their working iron, over every patient light my people ever lifted into the dark to say what we are now and say it forever. That this field remembers, and this field is kept, and nothing leaves or enters but that the keepers allow it. They came back to finish a world. They left thanking it for the door. And the door is watched, and the books are kept, and the watch does not end. It only changes hands. Mine are old now, and I have set this down so the next pair knows what they are holding. Not a weapon, not a grudge, a promise. 30,000 years deep, signed by everyone who ever died believing we would still be here when the sky came back. We are. Knock on the iron anywhere on this coast, and it will tell you the same thing it tells my granddaughter, dull and ordinary in ours. The most beautiful sound a kept world makes, still here.